The history of architecture traces the changes in architecture through various traditions, regions, overarching stylistic trends, and dates. The branches of architecture are civil, sacred, naval, military, and landscape architecture. Neolithic architecture. Neolithic architecture is the architecture of the Neolithic period. In Southwest Asia, Neolithic cultures appear soon after 10,000 BC, initially in the Levant and from there spread eastwards and westwards. There are early Neolithic cultures in southeast Anatolia, Syria and Iraq by 8000 BC, and food-producing societies first appear in southeast Europe by 7000 BC, and Central Europe by c. 5500 BC, linear band ceramic, and vinca. With the exception of the Andes, the Isthmo-Colombian area and western Mesoamerica, the people of the Americas and the Pacific remained at the Neolithic level of technology up until the time of Western contact. The Neolithic people in the Levant, Anatolia, Syria, northern Mesopotamia and Central Asia were great builders, utilizing mud brick to construct houses and villages. At Catalhoyuk, houses were plastered and painted with elaborate scenes of humans and animals. The Mediterranean Neolithic cultures of Malta worshipped in megalithic temples. In Europe, long houses built from wattle and daub were constructed. Elaborate tombs for the dead were also built. These tombs are particularly numerous in Ireland, where there are many thousands still in existence. Neolithic people in the British Isles built long barrows and chamber tombs for their dead and causewayed camps, henges, flint mines and cursus monuments. Antiquity. Ancient Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamia is most noted for its construction of mud brick buildings and the construction of ziggurats, religious temples made for worship of the gods and goddesses of Mesopotamia. The word ziggurat is an anglicized form of the Akkadian word zikkuratum, the name given to the solid stepped towers of mud brick. It derives from the verb zakaru, to be high. The buildings are described as being like mountains linking earth and heaven. The ziggurat at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley, is 64 by 46 meters at base and originally some 12 meters in height with 3 stories. It was built under Ur-Nammu and rebuilt under Nabonidus when it was increased in height to probably 7 stories. Ancient Egyptian architecture. In ancient Egypt and other early societies, people believed in the omnipotence of gods, with many aspects of daily life carried out with respect to the idea of the divine or supernatural and the way it was manifest in the mortal cycles of generations, years, seasons, days and nights. Harvests, for example, were seen as the benevolence of fertility deities. Thus, the founding and ordering of the city and her most important buildings were often executed by priests or even the ruler himself, and the construction was accompanied by rituals intended to enter human activity and to continued divine benediction. Ancient architecture is characterized by this tension between the divine and mortal world. Cities would mark a contained sacred space over the wilderness of nature outside, and the temple or palace continued this order by acting as a house for the gods. The architect, be he priest or king, was not the sole important figure, he was merely part of a continuing tradition. Greek architecture. The architecture and urbanism of the Greeks and Romans was very different from that of the Egyptians and Persians. Civic life gained importance for all members of the community. In the time of the ancients, religious matters were only handled by the ruling class. By the time of the Greeks, religious mystery had skipped the confines of the temple-palace compounds and was the subject of the people or polis. Greek civic life was sustained by new, open spaces called the agora, which were surrounded by public buildings, stores and temples. The agora embodied the newfound respect for social justice received through open debate rather than imperial mandate. Though divine wisdom still presided over human affairs, the living rituals of ancient civilizations had become inscribed in space. in the paths that wound towards the Acropolis, for example. Roman architecture. The Romans conquered the Greek cities in Italy around 300 years BC and much of the Western world after that. The Roman problem of rulership involved the unity of disparity. From Spanish to Greek, Macedonian to Carthaginian, Roman rule had extended itself across the breadth of the known world, and the myriad pacified cultures forming this ecumenia presented a new challenge for justice. One way to look at the unity of Roman architecture is through a newfound realization of theory derived from practice, and embodied spatially. Civically, we find this happening in the Roman Forum, where public participation is increasingly removed from the concrete performance of rituals and represented in the decor of the architecture. Thus we finally see the beginnings of the contemporary public square in the Forum Lulium, begun by Julius Caesar, where the buildings present themselves through their facades as representations within the space. As the Romans chose representations of sanctity over actual sacred spaces to participate in society, the communicative nature of space was open to human manipulation, none of which would have been possible without the advances of Roman engineering and construction, or the newly found marble quarries which were the spoils of war. Inventions like the arch and concrete gave a whole new form to Roman architecture, fluidly enclosing space in taut domes and colonnades, clothing the grounds for imperial rulership and civic order. This was also a response to the changing social climate, which demanded new buildings of increasing complexity: the Colosseum, the residential block, bigger hospitals and academies. General civil construction such as roads and bridges began to be built. The Romans widely employed, and further developed, the arch, vault and dome, all of which were little used before, particularly in Europe. Their innovative use of Roman concrete facilitated the building of the many public buildings of often unprecedented size throughout the empire. These include Roman temples, Roman baths, Roman bridges, Roman aqueducts, Roman harbors, triumphal arches, Roman amphitheaters, Roman circuses, palaces, morcelli, and in the late empire also churches. Roman domes permitted construction of vaulted ceilings and enabled huge covered public spaces such as the public baths like baths of Diocletian or the monumental Pantheon in the city of Rome. Art historians such as Gottfried Richter in the 1920s identified the Roman architectural innovation as being the triumphal arch, and it is poignant to see how this symbol of power on earth was transformed and utilized within the Christian basilicas when the Roman Empire of the West was on its last legs. The arch was set before the altar to symbolize the triumph of Christ and the afterlife. It is in their impressive aqueducts that we see the arch triumphant, especially in the many surviving examples, such as the Pont du Gard, the aqueduct at Segovia, and the remains of the aqueducts of Rome itself. Their survival is testimony to the durability of their materials and design. Byzantine architecture. The Byzantine Empire gradually emerged as a distinct artistic and cultural entity from the Roman Empire after AD 330, when the Roman Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire east from Rome to Byzantium. The empire endured for more than a millennium, dramatically influencing medieval and Renaissance-era architecture in Europe, and following the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, leading directly to the architecture of the Ottoman Empire. Early Byzantine architecture was built as a continuation of Roman architecture. Stylistic drift, technological advancement, and political and territorial changes meant that a distinct style gradually emerged which imbued certain influences from the Near East and used the Greek cross-plan in church architecture. Buildings increased in geometric complexity. Brick and plaster were used in addition to stone in the decoration of important public structures. Classical orders were used more freely. Mosaics replaced carved decoration. Complex domes rested upon massive piers, and windows filtered light through thin sheets of alabaster to softly illuminate interiors. Persian architecture. The pre-Islamic styles draw on 3,000 to 4,000 years of architectural development from various civilizations of the Iranian plateau. The Islamic architecture of Iran, in turn, draws ideas from its pre-Islamic predecessor, and has geometrical and repetitive forms, as well as surfaces that are richly decorated with glazed tiles, carved stucco, patterned brickwork, floral motifs, and calligraphy. Iran is recognized by UNESCO as being one of the cradles of civilization. Each of the periods of Elamites, Achaemenids, Parthians, and Sassanids were creators of great architecture that over the ages has spread wide and far to other cultures being adopted. Although Iran has suffered its share of destruction, including Alexander the Great's decision to burn Persepolis, there are sufficient remains to form a picture of its classical architecture. The Achaemenids built on a grand scale. The artists and materials they used were brought in from practically all territories of what was then the largest state in the world. Pasargadae set the standard. Its city was laid out in an extensive park with bridges, gardens, colonnaded palaces and open column pavilions. Pasargadae, along with Susa and Persepolis, expressed the authority of the King of Kings. The staircases of the latter recording in relief sculpture the vast extent of the imperial frontier. With the emergence of the Parthians and Sassanids, there was an appearance of new forms. Parthian innovations fully flowered during the Sassanid period with massive barrel-vaulted chambers, solid masonry domes, and tall columns. This influence was to remain for years to come. The roundness of the city of Baghdad in the Abbasid era, for example, points to its Persian precedents such as Firuzabad in Fars. The two designers who were hired by Al-Mansur to plan the city's design were Naubakhti, a former Persian Zoroastrian who also determined that the date of the foundation of the city would be astrologically auspicious, and Mashallah, a former Jew from Khorasan. The ruins of Persepolis, Ctesiphon, Sialt, Pasargadae, Firuzabad, Arg Yakutbam, and thousands of other ruins may give us merely a distant glimpse of what contribution Persians made to the art of building. The fall of the Sassanid Empire to invading Islamic forces ironically led to the creation of remarkable religious buildings in Iran. Arts such as calligraphy, stucco work, mirror work, and mosaic work became closely tied with architecture in Iran in the new era. Archaeological excavations have provided sufficient documents in support of the impacts of Sasanian architecture on the architecture of the Islamic world. Many experts believe the period of Persian architecture from the 15th through 17th centuries to be the most brilliant of the post-Islamic era. Various structures such as mosques, mausoleums, bazaars, bridges, and different palaces have mainly survived from this period. In the Old Persian architecture, semicircular and oval-shaped vaults were of great interest, leading Safavi architects to display their extraordinary skills in making massive domes. In the words of D. Huff, a German archaeologist, the dome is the dominant element in Persian architecture. Domes can be seen frequently in the structure of bazaars and mosques, particularly during the Safavi period in Isfahan. Iranian domes are distinguished for their height, proportion of elements, beauty of form, and roundness of the dome stem. The outer surfaces of the domes are mostly mosaic-faced, and create a magical view. Safavi Isfahan tried to achieve grandeur and scale knowledge about building tall buildings with vast inner spaces. However, the quality of ornaments was decreased in comparison with those of the 14th and 15th centuries. The great mosques of Khorasan, Isfahan, and Tabriz each used local geometry, local materials, and local building methods to express in their own ways the order, harmony, and unity of Islamic architecture. And thus when the major monuments of Islamic Persian architecture are examined, they reveal complex geometrical relationships, a studied hierarchy of form and ornament, and great depths of symbolic meaning. Islamic architecture Islamic architecture has encompassed a wide range of both secular and religious architecture styles from the foundation of Islam to the present day, influencing the design and construction of buildings and structures within the sphere of Islamic culture. Some distinctive structures in Islamic architecture are mosques, tombs, palaces and forts. Although Islamic architects have of course also applied their distinctive design precepts to domestic architecture, the widespread and long history of Islam has given rise to many local architectural styles, including Abbasid, Persian, Moorish, Timurid, Ottoman, Fatimid, Mamluk, Mughal, Indo-Islamic, Sino-Islamic and Afro-Islamic architecture. Notable Islamic architectural types include the early Abbasid buildings, T-type mosques, and the central dome mosques of Anatolia. Also, Islamic architecture also discourages illustrations of anything living, such as animals and humans. Africa. Great Zimbabwe is the largest medieval city in sub-Saharan Africa. By the late 19th century, most buildings reflected the fashionable European eclecticism and pastiched Mediterranean, or even Northern European, styles. In the Western Sahel region, Islamic influence was a major contributing factor to architectural development from the later ages of the Kingdom of Ghana. At Kumbasala, locals lived in domed-shaped dwellings in the king's section of the city, surrounded by a great enclosure. Traders lived in stone houses in a section which possessed 12 beautiful mosques, as described by al-Bakri, with one centered on Friday prayer. The king is said to have owned several mansions, one of which was 66 feet long, 42 feet wide, contained 7 rooms, was 2 stories high, and had a staircase, with the walls and chambers filled with sculpture and painting. Sahelian architecture initially grew from the 2 cities of Djenné and Timbuktu. The Sankor Mosque in Timbuktu, constructed from mud on timber, was similar in style to the Great Mosque of Djenné. The rise of kingdoms in the West African coastal region produced architecture which drew on indigenous traditions, utilizing wood. The famed Benin city, destroyed by the punitive expedition, was a large complex of homes in coarse clay, with hitched roofs of shingles or palm leaves. The palace had a sequence of ceremonial rooms, and was decorated with brass plaques. Southern Asia. Indian architecture encompasses a wide variety of geographically and historically spread structures, and was transformed by the history of the Indian subcontinent. The result is an evolving range of architectural production that, although it is difficult to identify a single representative style, nonetheless retains a certain amount of continuity across history. The diversity of Indian culture is represented in its architecture. It is a blend of ancient and varied native traditions, with building types, forms and technologies from West and Central Asia, as well as Europe. Architectural styles range from Hindu temple architecture to Islamic architecture to Western classical architecture to modern and postmodern architecture. India's urban civilization is traceable originally to Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, now in Pakistan. From then on, Indian architecture and civil engineering continued to develop, manifesting in temples, palaces and forts across the Indian subcontinent and neighboring regions. Architecture and civil engineering was known as Sthapatya Kala, literally, the art of constructing. The temples of Aihole and Patadakal are the earliest known examples of Hindu temples. There are numerous Hindu as well as Buddhist temples that are known as excellent examples of Indian rock-cut architecture. According to J.J. O'Connor and D.F. Robertson, the Sulba Sutras were appendices to the Vedas giving rules for constructing altars. They contained quite an amount of geometrical knowledge, but the mathematics was being developed, not for its own sake, but purely for practical religious purposes. During the Kushan Empire and Mauryan Empire, Indian architecture and civil engineering reached regions like Balochistan and Afghanistan. Statues of Buddha were cut out, covering entire mountain cliffs, like in Buddhas of Bamyan, Afghanistan. Over a period of time, the ancient Indian art of construction blended with Greek styles and spread to Central Asia. It includes the architecture of various dynasties, such as Hoysala architecture, Vijayanagara architecture and Western Chalukya architecture. The Church of St. Anne, which is cast in the Indian Baroque architectural style under the orientation of the most eminent architects of the time. It is a prime example of the blending of traditional Indian styles with Western European architectural styles. Buddhist architecture. Southeast Asia. Architecture of the Khmer Empire. Indonesian architecture. The architecture of Indonesia reflects both the cultural diversity of the region and its rich historical inheritance. The geographic position of Indonesia means a transition between the culture of Asian Hindu Buddhism architecture and animistic architecture of Oceania. Indonesian wide range of vernacular styles is the legacy of an Austronesian architectural tradition characterized by wooden pile dwellings, high-pitched roofs and extended roof ridges. The temples of Java, on the other hand, share an Indian Hindu-Buddhist ancestry. Typical of Southeast Asia, though indigenous influences have led to the creation of a distinctly Indonesian style of monumental architecture. Gradual spread of Islam through the region from the 12th century onwards creates an Islamic architecture which betray a mixture of local and exotic elements. Arrival of the European merchant, especially the Dutch, shows incorporation of many Indonesian features into the architecture of the native Netherlands to produce an eclectic synthesis of Eastern and Western forms apparent in the early 18th century Indies style and modern New Indie style. The years that followed independence saw the adoption of modernist agenda on the part of Indonesian architects apparent in the architecture of the 1970s and 1980s. Oceanic architecture.